The mist clung to the waters like a shroud. Across the mouth of the Zwin estuary, where the tide whispered against Flemish shores, 200 masts rose from the fog, a forest of timber and canvas, banners hanging limp in the breathless air of morning. This was no merchant fleet. This was the Grande Armée de la Mer, the pride of France, chained together in 3 mighty lines, creating a fortress of oak and iron that blocked the passage to Bruges. 18,000 men crowded these decks: Norman sailors, Picardy soldiers, Genoese crossbowmen, their armor dull beneath the gray sky, their voices a low murmur of anticipation. They had been waiting for the English, and the English came. Through the lifting haze, sails materialized like ghosts given form. 140 ships, lean cogs riding the western wind, their hulls rising higher than the French vessels, their forecastles and aftercastles bristling with humanity. 4,000 longbowmen stood ready, arrows nocked, their yew-bows taller than men. 1,500 knights and men-at-arms encased in steel gripped their swords. At the prow of the flagship, Thomas, a young king, surveyed the enemy, Edward III, 27 years old. His jaw set, his eyes burning with something beyond ambition. This was personal. The French had raided Southampton, burned English towns, captured his great ship, the Christopher. They had mocked his claim to the throne of France, laughed at his pretensions. Now on this Saturday afternoon, the 24th of June in the year 1340, the laughter would end. The tide was rising. The wind had turned. The sun broke through the clouds and shone directly into French eyes. Drums began to beat aboard the English ships. The sound rolled across the water, a heartbeat of war, growing louder with each passing moment. History held its breath. The destiny of 2 kingdoms, 2 peoples, 2 centuries of conflict, hung suspended in that instant before the first arrow flew. 3 years earlier, in 1337, the world had changed. Philip VI of France, invoking feudal law, had declared the confiscation of Gascony, the last great English possession in France. Edward III's response had been immediate and audacious. He would not merely defend his duchy, he would claim the entire French crown. Through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, he possessed what he believed to be the superior claim. French lawyers invoked Salic law, which barred inheritance through the female line. Edward cared nothing for their arguments. He quartered the golden lilies of France with the English leopards on his banner, and declared himself the rightful king of France. War followed inevitably, but this was no simple clash of armies. It was a struggle for supremacy over the wealthiest lands in Christendom. France held 20 million souls, the richest vineyards, the greatest universities, the power of the church. England, smaller and poorer, possessed one invaluable advantage: the narrow seas. Control of the Channel meant control of everything: the wool trade with Flanders, the lifeline to English territories in Aquitaine, the security of the island realm itself. Philip understood this perfectly. From 1338 onwards, French galleys had prowled English waters like wolves. They burned Portsmouth. They sacked Southampton, slaughtering civilians, loading plunder onto captured English vessels. The Christopher and the Edward, England's greatest warships, had been seized in German ports, an act of economic warfare that struck at the heart of the wool trade. For Flanders, dependent on English wool for its looms, the choice was clear: stand with England or starve. The Flemish cities rose in revolt against French overlordship. By May of 1340, Philip had assembled his armada at Honfleur, over 200 ships reinforced with Genoese galleys whose professional crossbowmen were feared throughout the Mediterranean. The plan was simple and devastating: blockade Sluys, cut off English access to Flanders, then launch the invasion of England that would end this war before it truly began. Philip's fleet sailed north and took position at the mouth of the Zwin, anchoring in 3 defensive lines. The trap was set. Edward III was unlike the kings who had come before him. Grandson of the great Edward Longshanks, he had learned war in the brutal campaigns of Scotland, where English tactics had evolved into something deadly: the integration of dismounted knights with massed archers, the use of defensive terrain to draw enemies into killing zones. At Duplin Moor and Halidon Hill, these methods had shattered Scottish armies. Now Edward would test them at sea. But the young king faced a fundamental problem. England possessed no standing navy. His fleet was a motley assemblage of requisitioned merchant cogs, Vessels pressed into service from every port in the realm. Their owners promised compensation that might never come. Royal agents had scoured the coast, seizing ships, building wooden castles fore and aft, installing crow's nests for archers. It was a desperate improvisation, assembled in mere weeks. Against him stood the accumulated naval power of France. On the French side, two commanders shared control, Admiral Hugues Quieret and Nicolas Béhuchet. Quieret was a knight of proven courage, veteran of Mediterranean warfare. Béhuchet, a former tax collector elevated to command, understood logistics and provisioning, but lacked battlefield experience. Between them simmered the tension of divided authority. Their Genoese admiral, Egidio Boccanegra, commanded the professional galley squadron, swift, oar-driven vessels crewed by experienced mercenaries. But the Genoese were unhappy. Disputes over pay had already caused Aten Doria's squadron to mutiny and sail home, reducing the Franco-Genoese fleet by a third. The French strategy reflected both confidence and caution. Chaining their vessels together created an immobile barrier, a floating castle 3 miles wide. It sacrificed maneuverability for defensive strength, transforming naval warfare into something resembling a siege. The crossbowmen would decimate any approaching force. The sheer mass of French numbers, 18,000 men against perhaps 6,000 English, would overwhelm any boarding attempt. Edward saw the situation clearly. Retreat was impossible. Withdrawal would mean navigating narrow waters under pursuit, ships picked off one by one. Politically, it would destroy his credibility with the Flemish allies upon whom his entire strategy depended. He had one choice: attack, win completely, or lose everything. Friday, June 23, 1340. The English fleet anchored off the Blankenberger coastal dike, within sight of Sluys. Scouts brought reports that chilled the blood. The French had fortified their position, ships lashed with heavy chains, decks packed with soldiers. The Genoese galleys held in reserve behind the main line. The inlet itself was a death trap, 3 miles wide at the entrance, narrowing toward Bruges, with shallow waters and treacherous currents. Any attacking fleet would be forced into a frontal assault with no room for maneuver. Edward called his war council. Some advisors urged caution, suggested negotiation, warned of the catastrophic casualties that would result from attacking such a position. The king listened in silence. Then he spoke. Tomorrow, he would attack, not out of recklessness, but because the wind and tide would serve him. The western breeze would carry his ships forward. The rising afternoon tide would provide momentum. The summer sun would shine directly into French eyes, blinding their crossbowmen at the crucial moment. God, Edward declared, had provided these advantages. To refuse them would be to refuse divine will. That night, the English prepared. Ships were arranged in a precise formation, each vessel carrying longbowmen flanked by ships filled with men-at-arms. The archers checked their bowstrings, tested the tension, ran their fingers along the smooth yew wood that had been their companion since childhood. Each man carried 2 sheaves of arrows, 48 shafts that could be loosed in 8 minutes of sustained fire. The knights donned their armor piece by piece, the familiar ritual calming nerves. Priests moved through the fleet, offering confession, promising absolution for what was to come. Across the water, the French waited. They had posted lookouts on the mastheads, but the fog played tricks on the eyes. Some thought the English were withdrawing. Others reported movement, but could not discern its purpose. Béhuchet ordered the chains checked, ensured every ship was properly lashed to its neighbors. Quieret toured the fleet, offering encouragement, reminding men that they outnumbered the enemy 3 to 1. The Genoese kept their galleys free, ready to strike at any weakness in the English formation. As darkness fell, fires glowed across both fleets. The last night before slaughter had begun. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. High tide. The English fleet surged forward on the western wind, drums thundering across the water, banners streaming, the leopards of England and the lilies of disputed France snapping in the breeze. The sun blazed down, merciless and blinding to French eyes. Edward's flagship led the assault, driving straight toward the Christopher, the captured English vessel that the French had positioned at the center of their first line, loaded with 400 crossbowmen. The French crews scrambled to their stations. Crossbowmen wound their weapons, placed bolts in the grooves, waited for range. But the English did not wait. At 200 yards beyond effective crossbow range, the longbowmen rose as one and drew. 4,000 bows came to full extension, arms trembling with the 100-pound pull. The order rang out across the water. Release. The sky darkened, not with clouds but with arrows, thousands upon thousands of them, arcing high then plunging down like iron rain. They struck decks, rigging, flesh. Men fell screaming. Others raised shields, but the arrows punched through wood and leather. The crossbowmen tried to return fire, but their rate was pitiful. 2 bolts per minute against the longbow's 6 arrows. The mathematics of slaughter were inexorable. Before the ships even collided, hundreds of French soldiers lay dead or dying. Crash. Grappling hooks flew through the air. Chains rattled as English cogs locked onto French vessels. The archers continued firing at point-blank range now, shooting down from their high forecastles into the crowded French decks. Then the men-at-arms leaped aboard, swords swinging, axes rising and falling. Ship to ship the battle raged. The Christopher was taken in fierce combat, its Genoese defenders overwhelmed by sheer English ferocity. The Black Cog fell. The St. George was boarded and captured. The French first line collapsed within an hour. Panic spread to the second line. Ships tried to break free from their chains, but the links held fast. They had become their own prison. English vessels methodically moved down the lines, taking each French ship in turn. Crossbow bolts and arrows filled the air. Men grappled hand to hand in blood-slicked decks. Ships burned. The water turned red. By 8 in the evening, the slaughter had continued for 5 hours without respite. The French second line had been annihilated. The third line, seeing the carnage, attempted to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The channels behind them were blocked. The Flemish, who had been watching from the shore with barely contained fury, now seized their moment. 8,000 Flemish militiamen launched small boats into the tributaries of the estuary, rowing furiously toward the trapped French rear. Admiral Quéré fought with desperate courage aboard his flagship, rallying his surviving men. But the situation was hopeless. English archers in the crow's nests of captured French ships now turned their bows on their former allies, raining arrows down from positions of perfect advantage. The Genoese galleys, which had held back waiting for an opportunity to strike, found themselves surrounded. Boccanegra attempted to maneuver his oared vessels through the chaos, but the narrow waters and the sheer density of wreckage made organized action impossible. The moment of absolute collapse came when the Flemish boats reached the French rear. These were not trained soldiers, but townsmen armed with clubs, axes, and burning hatred for the French overlords who had oppressed them for generations. They swarmed aboard the rearmost French vessels, killing indiscriminately. French sailors who leaped into the water to escape the English arrows found themselves clubbed to death in the shallows by Flemish peasants. Béhuchet was captured alive, dragged before Edward on the deck of his own ship. The English king's face was stone. He gave a single order: hang him from his own mast. The sentence was carried out immediately, in full view of the dying fleet. Quéré, wounded and exhausted, was also taken prisoner. When it was discovered he had commanded the raid on Southampton, Edward showed no mercy. The French admiral was beheaded on the spot. By 10 that night, it was over. Only a handful of French ships escaped, slipping away in the darkness. The rest, 190 vessels, were captured, burned, or sunk. The water for miles was choked with floating corpses. Chroniclers would later record that if the fish of Sluys could speak, they would speak French. So many bodies did they feed upon. The morning of June 25th revealed the true scale of the catastrophe. Bodies washed ashore for days afterward. Between 16,000 and 20,000 French, Normans, Picards, and Genoese lay dead. The bloodiest naval battle of the Middle Ages. English losses numbered fewer than 400, though Edward himself bore a wound from a crossbow bolt that had struck his thigh. The disparity was almost incomprehensible. France had lost not merely a fleet, but an entire generation of sailors. The institutional knowledge of maritime warfare accumulated over decades. For England, Sluys was transformative. It was the first great national naval victory, proof that an island kingdom could project power across the Channel and strike at the heart of continental enemies. Edward returned to London, hailed as Lord of the Seas. The longbow, already proven in Scotland, had now demonstrated its devastating effectiveness in naval combat. The tactical principles refined at Sluys, the integration of missile weapons with close combat forces, the use of elevation for superior fields of fire, would define English warfare for the next century, reaching their apotheosis at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. Yet the battle's greatest impact was strategic rather than tactical. By destroying French naval power, Sluys ensured that the 100 Years' War would be fought on French soil. The planned invasion of England died with the fleet at Sluys. From that day forward, English armies could cross the Channel at will, landing where they chose, burning and raiding through the richest lands in Christendom. The French, for all their vast resources and superior numbers, would spend the next generation fighting a defensive war, unable to strike at the heart of English power. Philip VI, upon learning of the disaster, reportedly raged that his admirals were cowards, then executed the messenger who brought the news. But no amount of fury could restore what had been lost. And on that blood-soaked estuary, beneath the smoke and the setting sun and the circling gulls, the course of two nations had been written in iron and fire and the cries of the dying.